The last thing I remembered from my old life was a truck horn and a very bad decision to check my phone while crossing the street in Chicago. The first thing I remembered from my new life was a slap. Not a metaphor, an actual slap across my cheek, delivered by a girl in a cheerleading uniform who was crying so hard her mascara had turned her face into a raccoon's. "You ruined everything, Beckett," she choked out. "I hope you rot." I blinked at her. My name wasn't Beckett. My name was, well, it used to be something else, something ordinary, something that belonged to a 26-year-old guy who worked at an insurance company and read too many web novels on his lunch break. One of those web novels was called Sundown Prep. It was about a scholarship kid named Theo Marsh who transferred to an elite private school in Maple Hollow, Connecticut, fell in love with the school's golden boy, and had to survive the school's reigning tyrant, a rich senior named Beckett Calloway who existed, as far as I could tell, purely to make Theo's life a nightmare for 300 chapters, until he got what was coming to him in the final arc. Expulsion. Public humiliation. A car accident that left him with a limp for the rest of his miserable, unloved life. I used to skim past his scenes. Nobody roots for the guy who trips freshmen in the hallway for fun. And now I was inside him. I looked down at my own hands, pale, manicured, a signet ring on the pinky that probably cost more than my old rent, and felt the particular horror of a man who has just realized he is trapped inside a story he used to make fun of. Beckett. The girl, Stella, I placed her now, minor character, dated Beckett for 2 chapters before he dumped her over text, shrieked again. "Say something!" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out except a small, undignified noise like air escaping a tire. Behind her, a crowd of students had gathered in a loose horseshoe around the school fountain, phones already up, already filming. I recognized a few faces from the story. There, near the back, arms crossed, was Theo Marsh himself. The protagonist, dark-haired, quietly furious, watching me with the particular stillness of someone deciding whether to intervene or let the villain drown. And that was the moment I made my decision. Standing there with a red handprint blooming on my cheek and 300 chapters of other people's memories flooding into my skull at once, I thought, I am not doing this. Not the bullying, not the rivalry, not the tragic third act comeuppance. I am going to keep my head down, graduate quietly, and disappear into some boring adult life where nobody remembers my name. It was, in hindsight, the single worst plan I have ever made, because absolutely nothing about the next 6 months went quietly. "You hit your head, my Beckett's," Mother said that evening, pressing a bag of frozen peas against my temple even though the slap had landed nowhere near there. The Whitfield girl's mother already called to apologize. I told her not to bother. You clearly deserved it. "Thanks, Mom," I muttered, and she gave me a look like I'd grown a second head, because apparently the real Beckett never once used the word thanks in his life. I spent the rest of that first week relearning everything. I had Beckett's memories, technically, his handwriting, his class schedule, the code to his locker, the particular way he liked his coffee, black scalding 4 sugars, which is a war crime. But the memories sat in my head like borrowed clothes. I knew the facts of his life without feeling the weight of them. I knew he had a father who was never around, and a mother who confused money for love, and a string of exes who all used the word cold to describe him. But none of that grief belonged to me. I was just a guy renting a stranger's tragic backstory, which made it a lot easier, honestly, to decide I wasn't going to repeat his mistakes. The problem was that Beckett Calloway did not exist in a vacuum. He existed in the middle of a plot, and plots, I was learning fast, do not particularly care what the main character wants. My first attempt at a quiet life lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, I was eating lunch alone. By choice, an actual novelty, since apparently Beckett always ate lunch surrounded by a rotating cast of people who feared him more than they liked him. When someone dropped a tray across from me, I looked up. Dark hair? A jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with a personal vendetta against soft edges. Eyes the color of strong tea. Theo Marsh in the flesh, sitting across from the villain of his own story like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're acting strange," he said. Not a question. "I'm allowed to eat lunch." "You're allowed to eat lunch surrounded by people telling you how great you are. This," he gestured at the empty seats around us, "is new." I shrugged, focusing very hard on my sandwich. Maybe I got tired of an audience. Theo studied me the way you'd study a math problem that had suddenly, inexplicably solved itself differently than expected. "Stella said you didn't even flinch when she hit you." I flinched internally. "You didn't yell at her or threaten to get her kicked off the squad. That's usually step one for you." I hadn't known that detail, but it tracked with everything else I'd absorbed. Old Beckett would have made Stella's life hell for that slap. New Beckett, me, just wanted the sandwich and the silence. "Maybe I'm turning over a new leaf," I said, and immediately regretted how much that sounded like something out of, well, a web novel? Theo's eyes narrowed, sharp and searching, like he was trying to find the trick. In the story, this was the exact chapter where he was supposed to start suspecting Beckett was up to something worse than usual. Some new scheme. Some new cruelty. I could feel the plot trying to click back into its groove, trying to drag me toward a script I refused to read from. "Fine," he said finally, standing, tray in hand. "Turn over your leaf somewhere else." I don't trust quiet Beckett. Loud Beckett I know how to deal with. He left. I exhaled for what felt like the first time since I'd woken up in this body, and told myself that it had gone about as well as it possibly could have. I was wrong about that within the week. The thing about being reborn as a story's villain is that the story keeps generating villain-shaped opportunities whether you take them or not. 2 weeks in, I learned that Beckett's father, a man I had never once met in 6 months of borrowed memory, a name mentioned maybe 4 times in 300 chapters, was flying in from Singapore for Parents' Weekend. This was not a plot point I remembered clearly, which meant either the original author had buried it in a filler chapter I'd skimmed, or something new was happening. Something that hadn't been written yet. That second option terrified me more than anything. "Your father wants dinner with the Whitfields," Mom announced over breakfast, not looking up from her phone. "The country club, 7 sharp. Wear the navy jacket, not the gray one." Why the Whitfields? She finally looked at me, and there was something calculating in her expression that made the hair on my arms rise. "Stella's father is buying out half of Calloway Textiles next quarter. Your father thinks it would smooth things along if you two patched up your misunderstanding." There it was. The real Beckett's slap-worthy offense with Stella hadn't been a stray plot beat. It had been engineered somewhere off-page by 2 families who saw their children as bargaining chips. I felt something twist in my chest that didn't belong to old insurance office me or old cruel Beckett. It belonged to whoever I was becoming in between. "I'm not doing that," I said. "You'll do what your father asks." "I'll go to dinner. I won't pretend to date a girl I insulted so 2 companies can merge." My mother set her coffee down with a click that could have cracked porcelain. "You've been different since the fountain," she said. "I don't know what's gotten into you, Beckett, but I'd suggest you get it out before your father arrives. He does not tolerate surprises." I didn't answer. I was too busy realizing that quiet life and family business merger, disguised as teenage romance, were apparently mutually exclusive goals. Dinner at the country club was exactly as excruciating as I expected, right up until the moment it became something else entirely. I was seated between my mother and an empty chair meant for Stella, who was 30 minutes late, and when she finally arrived, sat as far from me as the table allowed, arms crossed, eyes red-rimmed. Her father talked numbers with mine. My mother smiled the tight, professional smile of a woman doing math in her head. And I sat there in a stiff navy jacket, silently negotiating with myself over how many more minutes of this I could survive before saying something that got me disowned. That was when Theo walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there. Country club dinners for Fortune 500 textile mergers were not exactly scholarship kid territory. But there he was, in a server's uniform, carrying a tray of water glasses, clearly working a part-time shift I hadn't known existed. Our eyes met across the room for exactly 1 second before he looked away, jaw tight, shoulders squared like a man bracing for humiliation. I understood instantly and completely why. In the original story, this was the chapter where Beckett spotted Theo working a service job and used it as ammunition. A whole storyline about public shame, about Beckett accidentally spilling wine, about a cruelty so specific it became one of the most quoted scenes in the entire novel's fandom. I remembered it perfectly. I remembered every awful line of dialogue Beckett was supposed to say. I was not going to say them. When Theo circled to our table to refill glasses, I watched my father glance at him with the mild, unseeing disregard rich men reserve for anyone serving them water. And I watched Theo's hand tighten almost imperceptibly around the pitcher. Old Beckett's script called for a comment right about now. Something about tips. Something cruel enough to make the whole table laugh. Instead, I said, "Thanks." Just that. One word. Theo's hand paused mid-pour. His eyes flicked to mine. Startled, wary, searching again for the trick. And for a second, something passed between us that wasn't in any chapter I remembered. Something that felt unmistakably like the story bending sideways off its rails. My mother frowned at me like I'd committed a small social crime. Stella's father didn't notice at all. And Theo recovered fast, finished pouring, and moved to the next table without a word. But I caught just before he turned the corner of his mouth twitching upward, like he was fighting the urge to smile and losing. It wasn't much. It was one word and a twitch of a mouth. But it was the first scene in 6 months that had felt like it belonged to me and not to some dead author's outline. And I decided right there over a cold plate of untouched salmon that maybe a quiet life wasn't actually the goal I should be chasing. Maybe the goal was just not becoming the man everyone expected me to be. The dinner ended in a way I genuinely hadn't predicted, given everything I did remember about the source material. Stella's father raised his glass for a toast. Something about the future of our two families. And Stella, who had been quiet and furious the entire meal, suddenly stood up so fast her chair screeched against the marble-tiled floor. "I'm not marrying anyone's business deal," she said, voice shaking, but loud enough that 3 neighboring tables turned to look. Not even accidentally. Not even implied. I'd rather transfer schools. Her father's face went the color of the tablecloth. My father's jaw ticked. My mother's smile finally, mercifully cracked. I should have felt vindicated or at least entertained. In the story, Stella was barely a person. A 2-chapter prop who existed to get slapped and dumped and forgotten. But watching her stand there, hands shaking, refusing to be handed off like inventory, I felt something closer to kinship. We were both in our own ways trying to refuse a script someone else had written for us. "Stella," I said quietly before either father could recover enough to speak. "For what it's worth, I agree with you." Every head at the table turned to me like I'd announced I was quitting to join the circus. "Excuse me?" my father said. "I said I agree with her." I set down my fork. My hands were not shaking, which surprised me, given how loudly my heart was going. I'm not going to pretend to date someone to grease a merger. If Calloway Textiles needs Whitfield money that badly, it should say so in the boardroom. Not at a dinner table with 2 teenagers as collateral. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and expensive, like the tablecloth itself had gone rigid. My father recovered first, the way rich men always do, with a laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "My son has a sense of humor tonight," he told the table, and then, low enough that only I could hear it, "We'll discuss this at home." I didn't answer. Across the room, refilling a water glass at another table, Theo was watching me again. Not with suspicion this time, but with something that looked almost like the beginning of respect. I decided that whatever came next, whatever price I paid at home, it had been worth it for that look alone. The ride home was silent except for the specific, controlled fury of my father's breathing. My mother stared out the window like the passing streetlights held answers. I sat in the back seat and thought, absurdly, that this was the most alive I had felt since I'd died crossing a street in another life entirely. When we got home, my father didn't yell. That was almost worse. He simply said, "You will apologize to Whitfield in writing by Friday," and went to his study and shut the door. I went up to my Beckett's room, sat on the edge of a bed that cost more than my old car, and pulled out my phone. There was a message waiting. Unknown number. You didn't have to do that. I stared at it for a long moment before another message came through. "This is Theo. Got your number off the staff list at the club. Long story. Also, thanks. For the water glass thing and the merger thing." I typed back with fingers that were, for the first time all night, actually a little unhappy. Wasn't planning on becoming a decent person tonight. Just kind of happened. The three dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Careful," he wrote finally. "Keep that up and people might stop hating you." I looked at the message for a long time, feeling something unfamiliar and warm bloom in my chest. Not romance, not yet. Nothing that dramatic. Just the small, strange relief of being seen as something other than a villain for the first time in this borrowed life. I had come into this story wanting nothing more than to survive it quietly, unnoticed, unremarkable. I was starting to understand, with a mixture of dread and something that felt embarrassingly close to hope, that quiet had never actually been on the table. Not with a plot this determined to find me. Not with a boy this determined not to leave me alone. Friday came, and with it, the letter my father demanded. An official written apology to a business partner's daughter for a slap I hadn't caused in a fake romance I'd refused to fake. I wrote 3 drafts. The first was too honest. The second was too bitter. The third, the one I actually sent, said almost nothing at all, which felt somehow like the most honest option of the bunch. Stella wrote back a single line. "We're even. Stay out of my dad's business deals and I'll stay out of your fake redemption arc." I laughed out loud reading that alone in my room and realized it was the first time I'd laughed. Really laughed. Since waking up in this life. School on Monday was a different animal entirely. Word had gotten around the way word always does in a building full of teenagers with nothing better to do than trade rumors like currency. Beckett Calloway had refused a merger. Beckett Calloway had defended the Whitfield girl. Beckett Calloway had thanked a scholarship kid for pouring water. By first period, I had acquired a reputation for being, of all things, unpredictable, which for someone in my position was somehow both better and infinitely more dangerous than being feared. "You've made things complicated," said a voice behind me at my locker, and I turned to find a boy I recognized instantly, even without Beckett's memories doing the heavy lifting, because his face had been on the cover of the physical copy of Sundown Prep I used to keep on my nightstand back in Chicago. Callan Osei, the story's official second lead. Tall, easy smile captain of the debate team, the boy who spent 200 chapters quietly, achingly in love with Theo Marsh, and never once said so out loud, because the plot required him to lose gracefully in the final act so Theo could end up with, well, with whoever the actual endgame was supposed to be, before I showed up and started breaking things. "Complicated how?" I asked, closing my locker. Callan leaned against the one beside it, arms crossed, gaze sharp, and assessing in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Theo's. "Theo's been distracted all weekend. Won't say why. I have a guess, though, and the guess involves you being, I don't know, nice." Suddenly. "Is that a crime now?" "For you? Historically, yes." He tilted his head. "What happened to you, Calloway? 3 weeks ago you'd have laughed in my face for even having this conversation." I studied him for a long moment. There was no cruelty in his voice, just genuine, careful confusion, the confusion of a person watching gravity work differently than it used to. And underneath it, something else. A flicker I almost didn't catch, gone as quickly as it appeared, that looked less like confusion and more like recognition. It was such a small thing. A half second too long of eye contact, a tightness around his mouth that didn't match his easy tone. But it snagged in my mind like a splinter because I had felt that exact expression on my own face more than once since waking up in Beckett's body. The specific look of someone watching a story go somewhere they know it isn't supposed to go. Nothing happened to me, I said carefully, testing the water. I just got tired of being the villain. Callan's expression didn't change. Not exactly, but something behind his eyes did. A kind of stillness, a held breath. Funny thing to get tired of, he said, when you didn't know you were one. He walked away before I could ask what exactly that was supposed to mean. I stood there at my locker for a full minute, heart going harder than it had any right to, turning his words over and over. When you didn't know you were one. It could have meant nothing. A throwaway remark? A boy being clever for the sake of being clever. Or it could have meant everything. That Callan Osei, second lead of a 300-chapter web novel, somehow knew the exact thing I'd been hiding since I woke up in a fountain-adjacent nightmare on day one. I decided that morning that I needed to find out which. I didn't get the chance to ask him directly for almost 2 weeks because the story, apparently unwilling to let me have a single uncomplicated month, decided that was the exact moment to introduce a school-wide fundraising gala, complete with a mandatory student committee, a silent auction, and, because apparently my life required maximum humiliation potential at all times, a pairs dance number that the student council had unanimously and inexplicably decided should open the whole event. "You're on the committee," Theo told me flatly, sliding a clipboard across the library table where I'd been quietly, uselessly trying to read. I didn't sign up for a committee. Your name's been on every committee since sophomore year. Traditionally, you use committees to intimidate freshmen into doing your homework. This year, you're actually going to help, since apparently that's the new you. I eyed the clipboard like it might bite me. And the dance number? Pairs assignment, random draw. Theo's mouth did something complicated. Not quite a smirk, not quite a wince. You got me. I stared at him. He stared back, arms crossed, jaw set in the particular way that I was starting to recognize meant he was bracing for an insult that, historically, would have been well within Beckett's wheelhouse to deliver. "Okay," I said instead. "Okay?" "Okay, when do we start?" The way his face shifted then. Surprise breaking cleanly through the bracing, something unguarded slipping loose before he caught it and folded it away again. Was, I would think much later, the exact moment I stopped pretending to myself that whatever was happening between us was only ever going to be about survival. We practiced twice a week in the gym after hours, just the two of us, and a portable speaker and a choreography sheet neither of us fully understood. Theo was a terrible dancer, in the specific way of someone who had spent his whole life working 2 jobs and never once had time for a hobby that didn't pay rent. And I was a terrible dancer in the specific way of someone who was, structurally, borrowing a body that had apparently never once bothered to learn. "You're doing the thing again," he said, the 4th practice, catching my hand before I could step wrong for the 3rd time in a row. "Where you think too hard about it." "I'm trying to get it right." "You're trying to control it. Dancing isn't—" He paused, searching for the word. "It isn't a spreadsheet. You can't optimize it into correct." "Everything can be optimized into correct." He laughed, an actual laugh, short and startled out of him, like he hadn't expected to enjoy this evening as much as he clearly was. "You are the strangest version of yourself I've ever met, Calloway." "You've only known one version of me." "No," he said, quieter now, and something in his voice made the gym feel smaller, the space between us feel closer than the choreography strictly required. "I've known 2, and I like this one a whole lot better." I didn't have a response for that. My chest did something complicated and warm that had nothing to do with dance steps. And for a second, neither of us moved, his hand still loosely wrapped around mine, the portable speaker looping the same 8 bars of music on repeat because neither of us had thought to pause it. Then the gym door banged open, and Callan Osei walked in carrying 2 water bottles like it was the most natural thing in the world for him to show up unannounced at 9 at night. "Figured you two forgot to hydrate," he said, tossing one to Theo, who caught it on reflex, the moment between us dissolving as fast as it had formed. Callan's eyes flicked to me, just briefly, just once. And there it was again. That flicker, that held breath, that look of a person watching something they weren't supposed to be watching yet. "Thanks," Theo said, oblivious, twisting the cap off his bottle. "Yeah, you didn't have to." "I know." Callan's gaze stayed on me a beat longer than the sentence required. "Just wanted to check in on my 2 favorite disasters." He left as quickly as he'd come, and I found myself watching the door long after it swung shut. Certain. More certain than I'd been about anything since I woke up in this life. That Callan Osei knew something he wasn't saying, and that whatever it was going to matter a great deal, sooner rather than later. I finally cornered him 3 days before the gala, in the hallway outside the debate room, when Theo had been pulled into an emergency committee meeting about auction items, and I'd found myself, for once, unsupervised and unwilling to waste the opportunity. "You know something," I said, no preamble, the moment the hallway cleared. "About me. About what I am." Callan didn't pretend to misunderstand, which told me everything before he even opened his mouth. He leaned back against the lockers, arms crossed, studying me with an expression that had finally, fully stopped hiding whatever it had been hiding for 2 weeks. "I read the book," he said simply. "Sundown Prep, back where I'm from. Before I ended up here, in it, as the guy who spends the whole story quietly losing." The hallway seemed to tilt slightly under my feet. "You're reborn, reincarnated, whatever word you want to use." He shrugged, a small, tired motion, like he'd carried this for a long time and was relieved in a strange way to finally set it down in front of someone. "Woke up in Callan's body freshman year. Spent 2 years watching everything play out exactly the way I remembered it, right up until you decided to start improvising." I stared at him. 300 chapters of story, and I had never once suspected the quiet, kind, endlessly patient second lead was carrying the exact same impossible secret I was. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because for 2 years you were still the villain," Callan said, "and there was no cruelty in it, just plain fact. I watched you make Theo's life miserable exactly the way the book said you would, chapter after chapter, and I thought, okay, he's not like me. He's not aware. He's just him, doing what the story wrote for him to do." He paused. "And then you stopped." "I stopped because I remembered how the story ends for me," I admitted. "Expulsion. Public disgrace. A car wreck. I didn't want any of it." "I know how it ends for you," Callan said quietly. "I also know how it ends for me." The words hit harder than I expected them to. In the story I'd half forgotten, skimmed past, never taken seriously enough, Callan Osei's ending had been the quiet tragedy tucked into the margins of somebody else's happy conclusion. He confesses. He gets turned down gently. He smiles through it, gives a toast at Theo's wedding to somebody else, and the book calls it bittersweet and moves on, because nobody ever really cared about the boy who lost gracefully. "You've known this whole time," I said slowly, "that you were written to lose." "I've known this whole time," Callan corrected, "that I was written to lose to whoever the endgame love interest turns out to be. And for 2 years, I assumed that was going to be some random new transfer student in senior year, exactly like the book says." His eyes met mine, steady, unflinching, carrying 2 years of quiet grief he'd apparently never once spoken aloud to a single living person. "I did not expect it to be you." The hallway went very still. "I'm not—" I started and stopped. because I genuinely didn't know how to finish that sentence. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm not doing this on purpose. I'm not sure what I'm doing at all. I know you're not doing it on purpose, Callan said, reading the unfinished thought off my face like he'd had 2 years of practice reading people who didn't know they were being read. That almost makes it worse. If you were still the villain, I could hate you cleanly. Instead, you're just better. Somehow. And he's noticed, and I've noticed him noticing, and I don't know what to do with any of it except stand in gyms at 9 at night, handing out water bottles like an idiot. I didn't know what to say. There was no chapter I remembered for this conversation, no borrowed script to lean on, just two boys standing in a hallway, both of them strangers wearing the skins of people who used to belong to somebody else's story. I'm sorry, I said finally, because it was the only true thing I had. Callan gave a small, humorless laugh. Don't be sorry yet. Sorry's for after something's actually happened. He pushed off the lockers, straightening, gathering himself back into the easy, unbothered posture the rest of the school knew him by. Just do me a favor, villain. Yeah? If it's really you, he said, quieter now, all the performance drained out of his voice. If he really does end up choosing you, don't waste it. Don't do what the book almost did to him. Don't let this story turn him into someone else's happy ending that costs him everything real about himself. He walked away before I could answer, leaving me alone in the hallway with the growing, uncomfortable certainty that the story I'd been trying so hard to survive quietly had just gotten a great deal more complicated, and a great deal more painful for people who weren't me. The gala was 3 days away. I had a dance to finish learning, a boy I was falling for, whether I'd meant to or not, and a second lead carrying 2 years of silent grief who had just, with more grace than I probably deserved, handed me his blessing and his warning in the same breath. I did not, for one single second, believe the next 3 days were going to go quietly. I was, as it turned out, entirely correct. The morning of the gala, my father called me into his study, and I understood the second I saw the folder on his desk that Callan's warning had arrived about 48 hours too late to matter. Sit, my father said. I sat. He slid the folder across the desk without looking up from his laptop. Read that. Inside was a printout of a bank transfer, dated the night of the country club dinner. My name on it. My signature? Beckett's signature. A signature I had never once used because I hadn't known it existed until that exact moment. $40,000, wired to an account under Stella Whitfield's name. I didn't do this, I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I heard how thin they sounded, how exactly like something a guilty person would say. The bank has your signature. Security footage from the club has you at a terminal that night, during the hour the transfer went through. My father finally looked up, and his face had the particular blankness of a man calculating cost rather than feeling anger. Whitfield's lawyers called this morning. They're framing it as a bribe, an attempt to buy his daughter's silence about the merger conversation or possibly something worse. Either way, it looks like extortion, and it looks like it came from you. My stomach dropped somewhere near the floor. I hadn't been near a bank terminal that night. I hadn't signed anything. But I also knew with the cold, sinking clarity of someone who'd spent 6 months absorbing borrowed memories that I did not actually know everyone who might have access to Beckett's signature, Beckett's accounts, Beckett's life. Someone's setting me up, I said. That is remarkably convenient timing for a defense, my father said, given that you've spent the last month deciding to become a different person overnight. I opened my mouth to argue and found I had nothing. Because he wasn't wrong to be suspicious. I had changed overnight from his perspective. He had no idea it was because a stranger's soul had taken up residence in his son's body. All he saw was a boy who used to be predictable suddenly behaving in ways that made no sense, right before a $40,000 mess landed on the family's doorstep. I need to find out who did this, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. You need, my father said, closing the folder, to survive the gala tonight without giving the Whitfields any further reason to sue this family into the ground. Whatever else is happening, that comes first. I found Theo in the library that afternoon, half buried in gala logistics, and told him everything: the transfer, the signature, the accusation, because I had promised myself weeks ago that whatever else I became in this life, I wasn't going to be someone who lied to people who trusted him. He listened without interrupting, which I was starting to understand was one of the most Theo things about Theo, that he gave people the full weight of his attention before deciding what to do with it. "You really didn't do it," he said finally. Not a question, but not quite a statement either. "I really didn't." "Then someone wanted it to look like you did, which means someone had access to your signature, your accounts, and knew exactly when you'd be photographed near a terminal." Theo's eyes narrowed, the particular sharpness I recognize now as him working a problem the way he worked everything. Methodically, unhurried, refusing to skip a single piece. "Who benefits from you looking guilty?" "Stella's dad gets leverage on the merger," I said slowly. "My dad gets forced to smooth things over however Whitfield wants, and—" I stopped. "And?" Theo prompted. I thought of a boy with an easy smile who'd handed out water bottles at 9 at night, who'd stood in a hallway 3 days ago and handed me a blessing, wrapped so tightly around a warning I hadn't stopped to ask myself what he might do if that warning went unheeded. I didn't finish the sentence. It felt too much like an accusation I wasn't ready to make out loud, especially about someone who'd trusted me with his own impossible secret only days before. "I don't know yet," I said instead, "but I'm going to find out before tonight." I didn't find out before tonight. I found out during tonight, in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment, in front of the worst possible number of witnesses. The gala was exactly as gaudy and overproduced as every gala in every rich kid novel ever written. String lights strung across the gymnasium ceiling, an ice sculpture nobody asked for, a silent auction table stacked with donated vacation packages and signed sports memorabilia. Theo and I had made it through our dance number without either of us tripping, which felt honestly like a bigger accomplishment than surviving the framing attempt currently hanging over my family. We were still catching our breath by the refreshment table, his hand loosely brushing mine in a way that felt deliberate, even though neither of us had said so out loud, when Stella's father took the small stage at the front of the gym, microphone in hand, and announced he had an important matter of transparency to address before the auction began. I felt Theo go still beside me. "Several of you may have heard rumors," Stella's father said, voice carrying easily through the sound system, "about a financial matter between my family and the Calloways. I want to clear the air tonight, in front of the community, because I believe in transparency." He gestured, and to my genuine whole-body shock, a laptop screen lit up on the projector behind him, displaying the same transfer document my father had shown me that morning, blown up for 300 students and their parents to see. "Beckett Calloway," he said, "attempted to bribe my daughter into silence after his family's business dealings put undue pressure on her. I have the transfer records. I have the footage. I think it's time this young man faced real consequences for the way he treats people who don't have his family's resources." The gym went dead silent, 300 phones rising in near unison, and I felt every single thing I'd built over the last month. The quiet reputation, the small trust, the fragile unspoken thing growing between Theo and me. Teeter on the edge of collapse. "That's not true," I said, loud enough to carry, stepping forward before I'd fully decided to. "I didn't send that transfer." "The signature is yours," Stella's father said smoothly, entirely unbothered, the smile of a man who had planned this moment for weeks. "The footage places you at the terminal." "Someone forged it." "Convenient claim." And then, from the back of the gym, a voice cut through the murmuring crowd, calm and clear. "Actually, it's a provable one." Every head turned. Callan Osi walked forward, laptop under one arm, expression unreadable in a way that made my stomach twist with dread, and something close to hope in equal measure. "I run the AV club," he said, setting the laptop on the edge of the stage and turning it to face the crowd. Which means I also handle the security footage backup for the club's cameras, since their system's ancient and glitches constantly. I pulled the full, unedited file this afternoon after Beckett told me what happened. I hadn't told Callan anything. I hadn't spoken to him since the hallway, but I understood watching him work that he'd clearly heard the rumors circulating exactly the way everyone else had, and had gone looking on his own, apparently unwilling to let his warning to me curdle into a tragedy he could have prevented. He clicked play. The footage on the screen showed the terminal at the club that night. Showed a figure at it, yes, wearing a navy jacket identical to the one I'd worn, hair styled the same way mine had been. But as Callan slowed the footage and zoomed, the face became unmistakably, undeniably not mine. "That's my cousin," Stella said, from somewhere near the front, her voice gone thin with shock. She'd pushed forward through the crowd, staring at the screen with an expression of dawning, furious understanding. "That's Marcus. He's been managing Dad's account since spring." "Marcus," Callan said evenly, who I'd guess had access to both families' financial records, given the merger conversations. Enough access to know Beckett's signature. Enough access to time a transfer during a dinner where Beckett would be photographed nearby anyway. The gym erupted into a low, rolling wave of whispers. Stella's father's face had gone the color of the tablecloth from the country club dinner all over again, except this time there was no recovering with a smooth laugh. "This is," he started. "Doctored?" Callan offered, deadpan. "Funny, because I've got timestamps that match the bank's own transfer log, which your lawyers handed to the Calloways this morning. Feel free to have your people verify them against mine." I stood there in the middle of the gymnasium, surrounded by 300 students and half their parents, watching a boy who 2 years ago I would have mocked in a story I used to skim past, dismantle a public accusation against me with nothing but patience and a backup hard drive. Stella's father did not stay for the rest of the gala. He'd left within 10 minutes, Stella trailing behind him with an expression I couldn't fully read. Some mixture of humiliation and unmistakably relief. My father found me near the refreshment table not long after, face unreadable in the particular way of a man recalculating an entire situation in real time. "We'll discuss the details tomorrow," he said, which from him was as close to an apology as I expected to get, and walked off to find Whitfield's lawyers before they could leave the building. Which left me standing in the middle of a gymnasium full of dispersing students, staring at Callan Osei, who was closing his laptop with the calm, unbothered posture of someone who hadn't just rewritten the ending of a public scandal in front of an entire school. "You didn't have to do that," I said, echoing, without meaning to, the exact words Theo had texted me weeks earlier. "I know," Callan said. He didn't look at me the way he had in the hallway. No grief in it this time, no held breath. Just something quieter, settled. "I told you not to waste it if it turned out to be real. Figured I should hold myself to the same standard." "Callan, don't," he said, gentle but firm, already turning to gather his things. "I'm not doing this to be thanked. I did it because framing an innocent person, even one who used to be a genuine nightmare, isn't something I could live with watching happen. That's all. Doesn't change anything else." He left before I could find better words than the ones I already knew wouldn't be enough. I found Theo outside, on the low stone steps behind the gym, the string lights and noise from the gala fading behind us, the night unusually clear for late autumn, stars actually visible for once above the school's floodlights. "You okay?" he asked as I sat down beside him. "I don't know yet." I exhaled, long and slow, the entire evening finally catching up to my chest all at once. Someone tried to ruin my life tonight using a person I've never even met, and got stopped by a boy who has every reason in the world to want me gone. "Callan's not like that," Theo said quietly. He's better than almost anyone I know." "I'm aware," I said, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I meant it to, because Theo went still beside me, studying my profile in the dim light. "You know something," he said slowly. "About him. I can hear it. I thought about Callan's warning in the hallway. I thought about 2 years of silent grief carried by a boy who'd known, this whole time, exactly how this story was supposed to end for him. I thought about the particular kind of loneliness that must come with watching your own life play out as somebody else's background tragedy, and decided, sitting there under a clear autumn sky, that I owed him at least the dignity of not being the one to spill his secret before he was ready to. He's a good person, I said instead. That's all I know for certain. Theo watched me a moment longer, clearly unsatisfied, clearly aware there was more beneath the surface of my answer than I was giving him. But he let it go the way he'd been letting a lot of things go lately, trusting me with the silence in a way that felt, somehow, more intimate than if he'd pushed. Today was insane, he said finally, leaning back on his palms, tilting his face up toward the stars. Understatement of the century. You didn't run, he said. Any of it. The accusation, the whole gym watching, my everything. You just stood there and let it happen, and trusted it would work out. I didn't have much of a choice. You always have a choice, Theo said, turning to look at me properly now, something steady and searching in his expression. The old you would have run, or lashed out, or found someone smaller to blame so the attention shifted off him. His voice dropped, quieter now, almost careful. You didn't do any of that. You just stood there. Let people see you scared instead of hiding it behind something uglier. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, he said, that I've spent the last month falling for, whether I meant to or not. The night went very quiet around us, the gala noise distant and unimportant, the stars overhead indifferent to whatever was happening on a set of stone steps below them. I felt my heartbeat pick up in a way that had nothing to do with forged signatures or gymnasium scandals. Theo, I know it's complicated, he said quickly, like he needed to get the words out before he lost the nerve for them. I know there's history, and I know Callan's. I know there's things I don't understand yet about both of you. But I don't care about complicated tonight. I just care that you stood there in front of the whole school and let yourself be seen, instead of hiding. And I don't think I can pretend anymore that it didn't do something to me. I looked at him, really looked, the way I hadn't quite let myself since that first lunch tray dropped across from mine. And understood with a clarity that felt almost frightening that whatever quiet life I'd once hoped to build in this borrowed body was never, ever going to be the point of this story. The point had been this: him. Sitting beside me under stars neither of us had chosen, both of us finally done pretending we hadn't noticed each other months ago. I leaned in first. It felt right that I should be the one to close the distance. After everything. After the framing, after Callan's grace, after months of a story trying to drag me somewhere I refused to go. The kiss was brief, careful, more a question than an answer, but when Theo kissed me back, unhurried and certain, I understood that whatever came next, Marcus's motive still unexplained, my father's reckoning still ahead, Callan's quiet grief still unresolved somewhere behind us. None of it was going to be simple. But for the first time since I'd woken up in a stranger's story, I didn't want simple. I just wanted this. The days after the gala passed in a strange, fragile kind of calm. The sort of calm you don't quite trust because some part of you knows the story isn't finished handing out surprises. My father's reckoning came first, and it was almost anticlimactic after everything else. Whitfield's lawyers, once they'd reviewed Callan's footage against the bank's own timestamps, dropped every accusation within 48 hours. Quietly, without a single public statement. The way rich families always cleaned up their messes when the mess turned out to embarrass them instead of me. My father called me into his study again. Folder gone from the desk. Expression somewhere between relief and a discomfort he clearly had no idea how to voice. You handled that better than I expected, he said finally, which was, from him, roughly equivalent to a parade. Someone framed me for a crime I didn't commit, and I proved it. That's a pretty low bar. It's a bar you wouldn't have cleared 6 months ago, he said. and there was something almost like an apology buried in the observation, though neither of us was built for saying the word outright. I'll be having a long conversation with the Whitfields about their nephew. In the meantime, I'd like to understand what changed about you. I thought about telling him the truth. I thought about how absurd it would sound. I died crossing a street in another life and woke up as your son, and I've spent 6 months trying not to become the person your son used to be, and decided, the way I always decided with him, that some truths were better left as quiet, private miracles. I just got tired of being someone people were afraid of, I said instead, which was, in its own strange way, entirely true. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once and let it go. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was the first conversation we'd had in 6 months that hadn't ended in a slammed door, and I decided to count that as progress. Marcus, Stella's cousin, the forger, turned out to be easier to explain and harder to forgive than I expected. Stella cornered him herself, 2 days after the gala, in a conversation she later relayed to me over lunch, with the flat, furious calm of someone who'd already cried out every drop of shock the betrayal deserved. He owed people money, she said, picking at a sandwich she wasn't eating. Gambling debts. He'd been skimming from my dad's accounts for months to cover it, and when the merger talk started, he panicked. Figured if he could frame you for extortion, the whole deal would collapse, and nobody would look too closely at the actual numbers before that happened. So it was never really about me, I said. I was just convenient. You were a scapegoat, Stella said bluntly. Rich, disliked, standing near camera at the right moment. That's all it took. She looked at me then, something unreadable in her expression. For what it's worth. The old you might have deserved it a little. This you didn't. I didn't have an answer for that beyond a quiet, thanks. And she nodded like that settled something between us that had been unsettled since a slap by a fountain months ago. Marcus was quietly withdrawn from the school within the week. I never saw him again. I told myself the matter was closed. I was wrong about that, but wouldn't understand exactly how wrong for another few weeks yet. Callan, true to his word, didn't disappear or sulk or make things strange between the three of us, which somehow made me respect him more than almost anyone else in this entire borrowed life. He showed up to lunch. He showed up to Theo's debate meets, loud and supportive from the back row. He showed up one gray Wednesday afternoon, at my locker alone, in a way that told me this conversation had been building for a while. I'm not staying to watch the two of you be happy out of some noble self-punishment thing, he said, before I could even open my mouth. I want to be clear about that. I'm staying because you're both actually good people, and good people are rare enough that I'm not giving them up over something that was never going to happen for me anyway. Callan, let me finish. He exhaled, steadying himself. I spent 2 years thinking my whole arc in this life was going to be losing gracefully to whoever the book decided was the real ending. And maybe it still is. But I'd rather lose gracefully to something real. You standing in that gym letting yourself be seen, him falling for the version of you that actually deserves it, than win some hollow version where the story just handed him to me because the plot said so. He managed to smile, small but genuine. I'd rather be the guy who chose to be decent than the guy who got written a happy ending he didn't earn. I thought of everything he'd carried silently for 2 years as the grief, the certainty of his own ending, the quiet dignity of choosing kindness anyway, and understood, watching him walk off down the hallway with his usual easy stride restored, that whatever this story eventually decided to do with him, he had already, somewhere along the way, written himself a better ending than the original author ever had. It was 3 weeks later on an unremarkable Wednesday evening, curled up on my bed finishing an assignment I'd been putting off, that the calm finally, completely shattered. The knock on my door was soft, my mother's voice careful in a way I didn't recognize. Beckett, there's someone here to see you. He says he's family. I frowned, setting my laptop aside. Beckett had no family beyond the 2 parents I'd already met and absorbed 6 months of borrowed memory for. No siblings. No cousins close enough to visit unannounced on a Wednesday. I went downstairs and found a man standing in the foyer, maybe 40, dressed in a suit too plain and too worn to belong in a house like this, holding his hat with both hands, like a man bracing for a door to close in his face. "You don't know me," he said before I could ask. "But I knew your father a long time ago. Before he married your mother. Before Calloway Textiles was worth anything at all." Something cold slid down my spine. This wasn't a scene I remembered. Not from 300 chapters of borrowed memory. Not from any filler chapter I'd skimmed past in my old life reading this book on a lunch break. This was new. Unwritten. Which meant for the first time since I'd woken up in this borrowed body, I had absolutely no idea what was coming next. "I don't understand," I said carefully. "There's a version of this family's history your father worked very hard to bury," the man said. "A version involving a first wife. A son older than you, born and hidden away before your father ever met your mother." His eyes, tired and strangely gentle, met mine. "A son who spent the last 20 years believing he was owed everything you currently have, and who has, as of this month, finally found enough evidence to prove it." The foyer seemed to tilt beneath me, the same lurch I'd felt standing by a fountain 6 months ago, with a stranger's slap still stinging on my cheek. Because I understood in that instant, with a clarity that made my stomach drop somewhere past the marble floor, exactly who this stranger was describing. I remembered him now, buried in a footnote of a footnote, mentioned once in an early chapter I'd skimmed so fast in my old life I'd barely registered the name. A chapter meant only to establish in passing that the Calloway family's fortune had complicated origins. A single line about a forgotten half-brother, written and then abandoned by an author who apparently decided the thread wasn't worth pursuing. Except now, standing in my foyer, it was being pursued whether the original book had bothered with it or not. "Where is he?" I asked, voice quieter than I meant it to be. "This brother." The man's expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes went carefully, deliberately blank, the way people look right before they deliver news they know will detonate everything around them. "He arrives tomorrow," he said, "enrolling at your school under a name you won't recognize. Backed by documentation your father's lawyers won't be able to dismiss this time. Not the way they dismissed Marcus's little scheme. He spent years building this. Money, evidence, patience." He set his hat back on his head, moving toward the door, pausing only once more at the threshold. "He doesn't want the company, Beckett. He wants what he believes was stolen from him the day your father chose your mother over his. And from what I understand, he considers you the embodiment of everything he was denied." He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound that felt, to me, exactly like the closing line of a chapter I hadn't known was coming. I stood alone in the foyer for a long moment, my mother's voice calling something distantly from the kitchen, my phone buzzing once, twice in my pocket. Theo probably texting something small and ordinary about tomorrow's homework, utterly unaware that somewhere out there, a stranger wearing 20 years of grievance was already on his way to enroll in our school under a name none of us would recognize, carrying evidence, patience, and a hatred aimed squarely at a life I had only just begun, finally to feel like it belonged to me. I thought of everything I'd survived to get here, the framing, the gala. Callan's quiet grace. Theo's hand finding mine under a clear autumn sky. I had believed foolishly that surviving all of that meant the worst of this story was behind me. Standing in that foyer, phone buzzing gently against my leg, I understood with a certainty that settled cold and absolute in my chest that I had been wrong. The story wasn't closing a chapter. It was only just beginning the one that mattered. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake replaying every detail the stranger had given me, turning them over and over, searching for some way to prepare for a threat I couldn't yet see. From a brother I'd never known existed, arriving under a stolen name with 20 years of patience behind him. Around 2 in the morning, unable to stand the silence any longer, I texted Theo. "Can't sleep. Everything okay?" His reply came fast enough that I suspected he hadn't been asleep either. Everything's fine here. Why? What's wrong? I stared at the question for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen, unsure how to explain a threat I barely understood myself. Finally, I typed the only honest thing I had. I think something's coming, something bigger than Marcus, bigger than the merger. I don't know how to explain it yet, but I need you to trust me when I say, whatever happens this week, I need you to stay close. The three dots appeared immediately, then paused, then appeared again like he was choosing his words as carefully as I'd chosen mine. You're scaring me a little, Calloway. I know, I wrote back. I'm a little scared too. I set the phone down on my chest and stared up at a ceiling I still, some nights, couldn't quite believe belonged to me. Thinking about a boy arriving tomorrow under a false name, carrying 2 decades of stolen grievance toward a life I had only just learned, finally, painfully, gratefully, how to want to keep. Whoever he was. Whatever he wanted. Whatever the original story had never bothered writing about him at all. I was not going to lose this, not Theo. Not the fragile, hard-won piece I'd built out of a story that once tried to make me its monster. But lying there in the dark, listening to my own unsteady heartbeat, I understood with absolute, bone-deep certainty that the fight to keep it hadn't even started yet. Somewhere out there in the dark beyond my window, a stranger wearing my father's blood and 20 years of hatred was already on his way. And for the first time since I'd opened my eyes beside a fountain 6 months ago, gasping in a body that wasn't mine, surrounded by strangers who hated a boy I hadn't yet become, I had absolutely no idea, none at all, how this next part of the story was going to end.